and Bendy.
Hello and welcome to Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art. I'm Bendel Grosvenor, an art historian, and normally I'm joined by Waldemar Januszczak, art critic of the Sunday Times. But he's still away, and though he assures me it's not for much longer, I'm still here for those of you who can't go a week without an art historical fix. And today I want to talk about a really extraordinary painting and a moment in history which, the more I think about it, feels like one of those rare turning points in art. It's the sort of moment when something old quietly expires and something unmistakably new takes its place, even if hardly anyone notices at the time. And this moment doesn't happen in the usual capitals of European painting, not in Paris and not in Rome, but it's in London, in front of a burning building, with an artist standing in the crowd. The building is the Houses of Parliament. The artist is J.M.W. Turner, and the painting is called The Burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons, October 16th, 1834. Now today the painting lives in America, in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's one of those pictures we let get away when rich Americans were buying up the best of British art in the early 20th century. But before I describe the painting, I want to start with an eyewitness account of its creation, because it's far too good a story not to tell straight away. The scene is the exhibition rooms of the British Institution in February 1835, and our eyewitness is Turner's fellow artist, Edward Rippingill. He's watching Turner on what were called varnishing days. That's when painters were allowed to come in at the last minute and fiddle with their pictures before the doors opened to the public. Here's Rippingill describing what he saw. The picture when sent in was a mere dab of several colours, without form and void, like chaos before the creation. For the 3 hours I was there, Turner never ceased to work, or even once looked or turned from the wall on which his picture hung. All the lookers-on were amused by the figure Turner exhibited in himself, and the process he was pursuing with his picture. A small box of colours, a few very small brushes, and a vial or two were at his feet, very inconveniently placed. In one part of the mysterious proceedings, Turner, who worked almost entirely with his palette-knife, was observed to be rolling and spreading a lump of half-transparent stuff the size of a finger in length and thickness all over his picture. Presently the work was finished. Turner gathered his tools together, put them into and shut up the box, and then, with his face still turned to the wall, and at the same distance from it, went sidling off, without speaking a word to anybody. So that's Edward Rippingill describing how Turner painted the picture we're discussing today, The Burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons, October 16th, 1834. Rippingill describes an extraordinary scene in itself, but I think it also points to something much larger. And over the next half an hour, I'm going to try and persuade you that what Turner was creating on that wall was nothing less than one of the first truly modern paintings, and perhaps even the beginning of modern art. Before we go any further, let's slow down and have a close look at the painting itself. If you have a screen handy, you can find a high-resolution image on the Philadelphia Museum of Art's website. If not, don't worry, I'll describe everything we need to see. The picture is fairly large, about 90 by 120 centimetres, and Turner places us very deliberately. We're standing on the south bank of the River Thames, on a cold October night, looking across the river. On the opposite bank, over to the far left of the picture, the Houses of Parliament are ablaze. Not in a picturesque way, but in a genuinely alarming one. As a roaring mass of yellows and whites and reds, the building seems to have become a furnace. The flames shoot high into the sky and seem to consume the air around them. Beneath the flames you can just make out the small Gothic end wall of St. Stephen's Chapel, that's the old House of Commons, still standing like a stage set, but with the fire raging inside. Behind it, caught in the glow, rise the twin towers of Westminster Abbey. Then there's the smoke. It's not drifting politely upward, but it's blown sideways towards us, across the river, so that you can almost feel the heat travelling with it. The Thames itself sits strangely calm, like dark glass, but it's streaked with reflections of orange and gold. And cutting diagonally through the whole scene is Westminster Bridge, to our right. It's far larger than it really should be. The stone is pale in the moonlight on the end nearest us, but it becomes yellow by the flames reflected on it on the other side. The bridge seems to press in on the scene, giving the whole view a faint sense of claustrophobia. And in the foreground, we find ourselves among a crowd. Londoners are packed shoulder to shoulder, not fleeing the disaster, but watching it, as though it were theatre. Even the river is full of spectators, in dozens of tiny, hardly there boats. And this is a good moment to look a little bit more closely at Turner's technique, how he's doing it. If you look at the picture up close, a lot of it barely makes much sense. Whole passages seem quite abstract, more like sculpture than painting. At the top, for example, you see clearly the marks of the palette knife that Rippingille described, pressed quickly and rhythmically into the surface. And across the sky there are sharp flecks of red and yellow, little sparks of colour almost thrown on to suggest embers or fragments of flame. Even the smallest strokes feel forceful. Everything is applied with great energy. In some ways, the picture's really just painted. And then we notice the unusual composition. Turner was at the time Professor of Perspective at the Royal Academy, and he used to lecture students about where to place their brightest lights and deepest shadows. Safely in the middle, he said, never in the corners. And yet here he does exactly the opposite. The brightest blaze, the fire, is pushed off to the left-hand side, and the darkest areas are on the edges. The usual rules seem to be ignored. The whole construction of the painting forcefully draws us towards the fire. It's not so much showing it to us, but making us feel what it was like to stand there. So that's the painting. Now let's take a step back in time and explore the fire itself, because the history really matters here. It's the context that helps us make sense of what Turner was up to. On the morning of 16th of October 1834, 2 workmen at the Houses of Parliament were given a simple enough job: to dispose of a mountain of old tally sticks. These were medieval tax records, literally wooden sticks, with notches carved into them to show how much money someone owed. The system sounds faintly biblical even by 19th century standards, but they'd been piling up in the Exchequer offices for centuries, and someone finally decided it was time to get rid of them. Unwisely, the chosen method was to burn them in a furnace directly beneath the House of Lords. And you can probably guess what happened next. At first, the men fed them into the stove carefully, a few at a time as they were told. But as the day wore on, and doubtless eager to get home, they began shoving in whole bundles. And suddenly, by early evening, the chamber above, the House of Lords, was on fire. And soon the Commons caught fire too. And within a few hours, most of the old medieval Palace of Westminster had gone. London, meanwhile, did what London usually does in a crisis, and turned up to watch. Bridges and rooftops filled with spectators. Boats clustered on the river. The Times called it one of the most terrific conflagrations ever seen. In other accounts of the night, one of the favourite words of the age appears repeatedly: sublime. This was a word popularised in the 18th century to describe something that was both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. We still use the sentiment of the sublime in English today, if not the word, when, for example, we describe something in that curiously contradictory way as terribly good or frightfully good. But alongside the sublimity that night, there was something else: cheering. And this is where the politics of the time gives us an even more important context for Turner's painting. So let's spend a moment exploring that. By the 1830s, Britain was a deeply unequal political society. Perhaps it was more obviously unequal than at any time before. The population was growing, and industrial cities were exploding in size, and yet political power still sat almost entirely with the landowning class. Only about 3% of the population could vote, and that right to vote was tied to property. So Parliament remained, in effect, a private club for the landed class. The absurdities of this system were obvious. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham, with a population of hundreds of thousands, had no MPs at all, while places like Dunwich on the Suffolk coast, half of which had fallen into the sea centuries before, could still send multiple MPs to Westminster with just a handful of voters. These were the famous rotten boroughs. So it was easy for those without the vote to feel they were governed by those who rarely knew or cared how they lived. We often still hear today in British politics the phrase "one nation," as in one nation conservatism. And that goes back to this time in the 1830s. It's a line from a novel written by a future Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli. And he described how Britain was really not one nation, but two nations. And those nations were the rich and the poor. Disraeli wrote that these two nations were as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, who are fed by a different food, are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws. And broadly, Disraeli was right, which is why many thought quite seriously at the time of revolution. In fact, the early 1830s was probably the closest Britain has come to a genuinely popular revolution. And after a great deal of unrest, including fatal riots in cities like Bristol, the governing class eventually accepted the need for change. But not much change. By the so-called Great Reform Act of 1832, the right to vote was extended from about 3% of the population to about 5% of the population. And practically the same aristocratic interests still dominated Parliament. So when 2 years later, in October 1834, that same Parliament burned down, it looked to many watching like poetic justice. In fact, we know from reports on the night that most people watching cheered and laughed as the various buildings collapsed. For most people, it was theatre. But for one man in the crowd that night, our artist, J.M.W. Turner, it was material. Let's take a quick break there, and when we come back, we'll explore further how Turner responded to this dramatic event.
Waldy and Bendy.
Welcome back. I'm Bendy Grosvenor, and we're discussing Turner's painting, The Burning of the House of Lords and Commons, October 16th, 1834. Now, on the night, we know Turner is there, likely with his sketchbook in hand, moving around the fire to record it from one angle to another. There's a fabulous watercolour study of the fire taken between Westminster Abbey and the burning Parliament building, and that's in the Tate Gallery. But I want to focus quickly more on what was going on inside Turner's head at the time, more than what he was producing in his sketchbooks. What did he think as he saw Parliament collapse? Was Turner cheering along with everyone else as the fire spread? Unfortunately, we simply don't know. Politically, Turner is one of those figures who keeps his counsel. He was famously taciturn and worked as happily for slave owners as radical politicians. As the Times put it in his obituary, he seemed to enjoy being only half understood. You can imagine him grunting rather than explaining himself, just as Timothy Spall played him so beautifully in the film Mr. Turner. It is tempting to imagine that Turner was a bit of a radical, the self-made son of a Covent Garden barber. But the truth is, we can't pin his politics down. What we can say, though, and this matters more for our story, is that artistically he began life as almost the opposite of a radical. When we think of Turner today, we tend to picture those amazing late masterpieces, The Fighting Temeraire or Rain, Steam and Speed, those dazzling near-impressionistic canvases. But those come much later, and after the Westminster Fire. A Fighting Temeraire was painted in 1839, Rain, Steam and Speed in 1844. The young Turner was a very different creature indeed. His early career is in many ways quite conventional. He enters the Royal Academy schools as a teenager, he copies antique casts, he studies the old masters, and he learns to paint in the approved grand manner taught by the Royal Academy's first president, Sir Joshua Reynolds. He absorbs landscapes by Claude Lorraine, seascapes by Willem van der Velde, all the pictures that the landowning classes admired, and he paints what those classes want. Estate views, picturesque valleys, shipping scenes, polite sunsets. And this works for him. He rises astonishingly fast. He becomes a full Royal Academician in 1802, the youngest ever, just aged 26, and then he's made Professor of Perspective in 1807. By the time most artists are still finding their feet, Turner was already part of the establishment. He was extraordinarily good at pleasing the system, and he became rich in doing so. But here's the thing. There was always another Turner hovering in the background, a quicker, freer Turner. You see this Turner in his more private works, those not made for public exhibition, especially his sketchbooks and studies. So how do we explain this tension? Why does a painter with that much natural talent spend so long playing by the rules? Why all that restraint? And here I think John Ruskin, Turner's great champion, puts his finger on it best. Ruskin believed the Royal Academy itself held Turner back, that it trained him too severely, that it, in Ruskin's words, repressed his perceptions of truth, his capacities of invention, and his tendencies of choice. In other words, Turner had to fight for his own education. Ruskin even says that for Turner, it was impossible to do right but in a spirit of defiance. And that phrase, a spirit of defiance, I think is a really good one for us to consider more deeply for a second, because it gives us a way of thinking about the rest of Turner's career. If we're looking for the moment when Turner really changes, when that defiance finally breaks through, then we have to ask, when did he start trusting his instincts? Because although it's tempting to point to those late masterpieces like The Fighting Temeraire and treat them like sudden miracles, as though Turner woke up one morning and just decided to paint differently, we have to remember that artists don't usually change like that. Something pushes them and makes their old language feel inadequate. So here's the crucial question. What pushed Turner and when? And I think the answer is simple. It was the fire of 1834. For a painter of his temperament, the whole scene must have been irresistible. Heat, light, smoke, water, noise, night, history unfolding in real time with nobody quite sure what would happen next. It was everything Turner had been circling around for years, and suddenly it was all there at once. It was a combination so overwhelming that the old prescribed way of painting simply wouldn't do. So he had to try something new to match it. And once he'd done that, once he realized a painting could be built out of light and atmosphere and feeling rather than careful description, there was really no going back. So the fire of 1834 was the moment of defiance that Ruskin said Turner needed. Just as the crowds by the Thames were defying the old political order with laughter, Turner was quietly defying the old artistic order. And that's why he sends in for exhibition at the British Institution in 1835 a canvas that was barely begun, little more than dabs of colour. And then he finished it in public from his memory and his imagination. And as he did so, he broke all the usual rules of painting. Perspective is exaggerated, detail dissolves, the bridge looms unnaturally, the lights and the shadows are in the wrong places, the crowd becomes a rhythm of dark strokes, And although the title of the painting is very direct and descriptive, The Burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons, October 16th, 1834, Turner wasn't just showing what the fire looked like, but what it felt like to be there, with the glare in your eyes and the heat on your face. And that, to my mind, is a modern ambition. Because if modern art really means anything, it's this: the moment painters stop copying the world and start translating their experience of it instead. And isn't that what we see here with Turner? Now, Turner couldn't quite leave the subject of the fire alone, for he soon painted it again, which shows you just how much it mattered to him. In a picture which now belongs to the Cleveland Museum of Art, he showed the fire from slightly further downstream, with the Thames opened out so we can see more of the fire reflected in the water. The subject is a little calmer, perhaps a little bit more conventional, but critics were still baffled, and one newspaper critic even suggested that the Royal Academy should throw a wet blanket over this Fire King or his works. Now, isn't that a great name? The Fire King. It was meant as mockery, but a king Turner was about to become of a new kind of painting. The art historian Olivier Meslay calls Turner the man who set painting on fire, which feels to me exactly right, because it's from this moment that the late Turner really finds his confidence. The Turner who paints the Fighting Temeraire, and Rain, Steam and Speed, and all those extraordinary, dissolving, light-filled canvases of a kind which nobody had seen before, and which seemed to belong to the future. Now, here's my final thought. Despite what I may have suggested at the beginning of this podcast, I don't really believe that we can point to a single day or a single painting and say, this is where modern art begins. Art history is never that tidy. Some say modern art was invented in France in the 1860s, but I could happily show you pictures from the 16th century that feel just as modern. And there's a broader point here. Can any individual artist start a new artistic movement? Not really. My unfashionable view in art history is that we sometimes give artists, as great as they can be like Turner, a little bit too much credit and too much agency. We like to imagine they drove art forward in a sequence of stylistic evolutions. You know how it goes. Renaissance becomes eventually Mannerism, and then we go to Baroque and Rococo and Neoclassicism to Romanticism and so on, all the way through to Modernism. It's a neat, comforting story, but it's mostly one we've invented later. Those labels were mostly dreamt up in the 19th and 20th centuries by art historians trying to make sense of everything. In fact, life isn't like that, and art isn't either. Artists work in a world shaped by many forces. Of their own genius, yes, but also a world of patrons and audiences, of events and even accidents. And sometimes those forces matter more than artistic inspiration. And that's why, for me, the burning of Parliament and Turner's painting of it really matters. It was the moment he felt he had to change. Even if we can't say exactly where modern art begins, the fire of 1834 and the picture Turner finished in stunned silence at the British Institution in 1835 mark a pair of endings, at least in British art. One was the end of an ancient building that embodied the old political order, which collapsed in flames to the sound of cheering. The other was the end of an old idea of what painting was supposed to be, and that ended more quietly, on a gallery wall. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art. We'll be back next week. See you then.
Waldy and Bendy.